Hey guys, Edward here from Edward279, the mixed content creator. Now, last week I posted a video explaining why some foods are actually radioactive. And in that video, I said that I would be creating a follow-up video about the top 10 most radioactive foods in the world, i.e. this video. Before we get started, however, I should note that the radioactivity of these foods will be measured in picocuries per kilogram. And if you're wondering, a picocurie is the equivalent of 1 trillionth of a curie. And all of these foods are still perfectly safe to eat regardless of their appearance on this list. So without further ado, let's get into the list. First up, right off the bat, we're starting with something rather surprising. Peanut butter. Whether you like it smooth or chunky, one thing you're almost bound to find is, you guessed it, radiation. Now, to be clear, the peanut butter itself isn't radioactive, as peanut butter actually owes its radioactivity to each of the radioactive isotopes radium-226 and radium-228. The peanut plant takes in from the soil. As well as that, even though peanut butter isn't that high in potassium like other foods and drinks on this list, it still contains the radioactive isotope potassium-40. That said, the amount of these isotopes is really low, and peanut butter is a great source of unsaturated fats and protein, so you should still definitely eat it if you already are, as the radioactive isotopes in all of the foods on this list, for that matter, are in very low concentrations. Peanut butter comes in at number 10 on this list, having 120 picocuries of radiation per kilogram. Now, I mentioned in last week's video that most drinking water is contaminated with radioactive elements like radium and uranium, but the truth is, these elements occur in very small amounts and are most certainly not gonna harm you. But you might be asking me, why are these elements even in the water supply in the first place? Well, in the case of groundwater, trace amounts of naturally occurring radioactive elements like uranium and thorium, as well as radium, can dissolve and leach into the water supply, and radon gas can do the same. Now, if this happens to frighten you, don't worry. Like with all the foods and drinks on this list, these elements occur only in very small amounts, and you'd need to drink an absolutely insane amount of water to get sick from the radiation. That said, even though water is incredibly weak in terms of radiation compared to something like, say, a uranium ore, it's among the most radioactive foods and drinks out there, with drinking water having 170 picocuries of radiation per kilogram. This boozy beverage might not seem to be packing a radiation punch, but it's way more radioactive than you think. Now, to be clear, the whole thing about American alcohol needing to be radioactive by law is a complete myth. But beer does have the naturally occurring radioactive isotope potassium-40. So even without adding anything, beer is already among one of the most radioactive foods, or should I say, drinks in the world. Now, like with all of the other foods and drinks on this list, beer isn't itself radioactive, instead owing its radioactivity to the radioactive isotope known as potassium-40. Which is kind of weird, given the boozy beverage's potassium content is, modest at that. But even with the modest potassium content, beer still manages to crash in at number 8 on this list. All thanks to the radioactive potassium-40 that gives beer a radioactivity of 390 picocuries per kilogram, which is still perfectly harmless for that matter. Even the supposed emblem of good health and wellness does have a dark side. And in avocados, it's radiation. The fruit is packed full of potassium, packing even more of a punch than the famously potassium-filled banana, and as such, avocados predictably owe their radioactivity to radioactive potassium isotopes found in the fruit and its insanely high amount of potassium. This is a common theme on this list, as almost all of the foods that are the most radioactive are also the ones with the most potassium, like bananas, red meat, and, you guessed it, avocados. That's because foods this high in potassium are pretty much bound to have radioactive potassium isotopes hiding within, even though the radioactivity of avocados is in such small amounts that it can't do any sort of harm to you. And radiation aside, avocados are incredibly good for you. That said, avocados are among the most radioactive items at your local grocery store, with avocados having 2,500 picocuries per kilogram. This is another one that may be surprising, but red meat, just like avocados, is high in potassium, and as such contains the radioactive isotope potassium-40, which is also found in other potassium-filled foods, like the aforementioned avocado. However, what I didn't mention earlier is that foods high in potassium often come with another radioactive element, radium, which, together with potassium, make frequent appearances on this list. Red meat also contains trace amounts of radium, and when combined with the aforementioned potassium, you get one of the most radioactive foods on Earth. That said, the radiation is totally harmless, and red meat as a whole is still not that bad. Like I said in my 13 foods that seem unhealthy but actually aren't video, red meats are full of iron, zinc, selenium, and vitamins B12 and B3, but do be careful of their saturated fat content. Red meat comes in at a solid number 6 on this list, with red meat holding 3,000 picocuries of radiation for each kilogram. Like the peanuts used to make the peanut butter I mentioned earlier, carrots also take up radioactive isotopes from the soil, which means that radioactive isotopes like radon-226 that wouldn't otherwise be there break in from the plant, taking these radioactive isotopes up. Carrots also have a large amount of potassium, and as such, such comes with the presence of another radioactive isotope, potassium-40, which you may already be familiar with from other foods previously mentioned on this list. However, like in literally all the other foods and drinks on this list, the radiation is harmless, and carrots as a whole are really healthy for you, as they're full of antioxidants known as carotenoids, and also full of other vitamins and minerals and other nutrients that bring big benefits. Carrots are among the most radioactive foods, even among those full of potassium, as carrots have 3,400 picocuries of radiation in each kilogram of this orange root vegetable. As one of the most common, filling, and nutritious foods in the world, you'd probably absolutely never think that potatoes are actually radioactive. But breaking news, they most definitely are. That's because potatoes are rich in potassium, and just like with other foods high in potassium on this list, potatoes most definitely have the radioactive isotope potassium-40. And also, just like with other high potassium root crops like carrots and peanuts, potatoes take up various radioactive radium isotopes from the soil. And as such, potatoes also have radium alongside their potassium to make one of the most radioactive foods in the world. But just like with all other foods and drinks on this list, the radioactive potassium and radium isotopes are in such low quantities that they're completely harmless, even though potatoes are one of the most radioactive foods on this list, and the world. Potatoes rank a solid number 4 on this list, with potatoes having 3,400 picocuries of radiation per kilogram of spuds. As one of the most famous examples of radioactivity in the foods we eat, bananas are the poster child for food radiation. So much so that radioactivity is sometimes measured in a unit known as the banana equivalent dose. And for good reason. Bananas are incredibly high in potassium, and as such contains the radioactive isotope potassium-40. And unlike many other foods on this list, bananas either don't contain or contain very little of the element radium, an element that made appearances several times on this list, and is often found in foods that also contain high levels of potassium. And as for why this doesn't matter at all, banana radioactivity is still so low you'd need to eat an absolutely insane amount of bananas to get sick, let alone die, as you'd need about, get this, 50 million of these sweet yellow bundles of joy to obtain the lethal radiation dose. That being said, bananas are not the world's most radioactive food, as bananas only have around 3,500 picocuries of radiation per kilogram. Taking the silver medal on this list is none other than the lima bean, a food most people would never suspect is radioactive, but actually kind of is. The reason I said that kind of part is because lima beans themselves aren't radioactive, but instead these beans owe their radioactivity to a comparatively high level of potassium-40, as well as smaller amounts of radium as well as the radioactive isotope radon-226, which normally, if not always, occurs as a gas. And if you're wondering, yes, lima beans made it onto my 15 foods that can actually kill you video. Link to that in the description below. Not because of the legume's radioactive isotopes, but instead something I discussed further in that video. Again, link in the description below, but I digress. Even though they aren't as well known for radioactivity as bananas, they are actually more radioactive than bananas, which with each kilogram of limas holding 4,600 picocuries of radiation, which is still absolutely nothing compared to the food at the number one spot on this list. And yes, even at this point, the radiation level is still perfectly harmless. And finally, the number one most radioactive food in the world is drumroll please, Brazil nuts. That is right, these relatively unsuspecting nuts actually pack a dirty secret. And that secret is just how much radiation they pack compared to other foods. That's because, one, like bananas, they contain the radioactive isotope potassium-40, and two, Brazil nut trees, especially those growing in the country of Brazil, take up both radium-226 and radium-228, two very radioactive isotopes of the element radium. Also, in my 15 foods that can actually kill you video, I mentioned that Brazil nuts are radioactive, with me saying, quote, Brazil nuts are actually radioactive, especially if they're from Brazil. That's because Brazilian Brazil nuts frequently contain high concentrations of radium, a radioactive element that trees absorb from the soil, end quote. And even though the radiation is still perfectly harmless, Brazil nuts are the most radioactive food in the world, with 1 kilogram of these nuts containing a whopping 12,000 picocuries of radiation. So there you have it, the top 10 most radioactive foods and drinks in the world, and why it doesn't matter at all how radioactive the food you eat is. We hope you enjoyed this video. As always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!